Hello and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch. I'm Erin McDowell and I'm especially excited today because we're actually filming this on the release day of my new book, Savory Baking. I could not be more thrilled. And to celebrate the release, I wanted to make 3 of my favorite show-stopping savory pies. First, we're gonna be making my meat and potatoes pie, which combines the classic sort of beef stew, and it has this incredible potato topper, all wrapped in a buttery pastry crust. Next, we're gonna make one of my favorite vegetarian pies that's in the book. This is my greens and hominy pie, and it actually has 2 distinct layers, 2 delicious fillings that pair beautifully together. And then finally, we're going to be making my savory take on a chess pie, which is my Manchego Chess Pie. This is such a yummy recipe, and I even like to serve it with a slice of quince paste. Don't make pie only the dessert. Make it the entree. Make it the side dish. Let's pie all the time. Am I right? We're going to be making 3 single crust pies today, and you know the rule when we're making a single crust pie. I've talked about it a bunch before. We need to par bake these pies. Let's talk about par and blind baking. You know this is very important to me. You must, yes, must, par bake your crust. We want to consider par baking. I do strongly recommend par baking these crusts. I will say again that I like to bake and par bake and really just generally bake pies on a baking steel or a pizza stone. They don't always require par baking, but sometimes I still like to par bake them. Even though we've talked about it before, let's get a little refresher. I've got 3 par baked crusts in front of me. One of my favorite things about par baking is even after par baking, we are already well on our way to passing the Sturdy Pie Challenge. I mean, look at that, it's beautiful. And this is a good indicator of what a proper par bake should be. Lightly golden brown around the edges, only just baked in the base, but when you turn it over, you'll see we are starting to brown. And again, the reason that we do this par baking or partial baking is because the fillings we're gonna put inside are heavy and they really weigh things down. So we wanna make sure that we are baking that crust sufficiently before we get started. So a couple other reminders when you're par baking. I'm just gonna get one more crust ready to go while we chat about the rest of these things. You're gonna wanna make sure you dock that dough very, very well. You can see the little dock marks, in fact, on my pastry here, even after baking, but they are all filled in, so don't worry about creating holes in your pastry. But we want to dock really well on not only the base, but also the sides of our dough. This is going to help steam escape during baking, and it will help the dough from puffing up too much while it bakes. We're also going to use pie weights, and we need to use the proper amount of pie weights. We gotta use them all the way up to that top edge to make sure that the dough is sufficiently weighed down. Pie weights are not only weighing down the bottom of the pie, they're also weighing down the sides. So especially for people who struggle with the sides of their dough sliding down on the pie pan during baking, this is a tip for you. Use more pie weights, guys. Once I am ready to bake, I wanna make sure that that crust is chilled really, really well. And then I wanna bake it first with the pie weights in it. Then I'm gonna take it out. I'm gonna remove the pie weights. And if I notice that it's starting to puff up a little bit anywhere, I might even hit it with that fork or the tip of a knife one more time to help remove any puffiness or air pockets that could start to occur during that first part of baking. Then with the pie weights out, we bake it a little bit longer just to dry out the base. And again, kind of the magic thing you're looking for here is the base to be matte in color. So you can see that it's not browned, but it doesn't look shiny or like the dough is raw. It is actually fully baked, but it hasn't gained any color yet. And then the most important thing, once we've par baked, is we've got to let it cool completely before we put any filling into the crust. So we want to make sure that our crust has a chance to cool to room temperature before we fill it. If we fill it while it's hot, it can sog out that crust, and if we add a hot filling to it, we can sog it up and also kind of ruin all of that work that we just did trying to get it so lovely and crispy. So I'm gonna finish up this crust. You got your little par baking refresher. Now let's dive into some of the fillings that we're gonna use to fill our 3 savory pies. Let's start with my meat and potatoes pie. This is a really yummy pie. It sort of starts with a filling of beef stew and then finishes with a topping that's inspired by Duchess potatoes, or kind of this piped roasted potato situation. So I'm gonna start by seasoning my beef here. I have beef stew meat. Let's get some nice salt and pepper going on in here, and we're gonna sear this up. I have a nice Dutch oven next to me. I've turned it on sort of a medium to medium high heat, and I'm gonna add some neutral oil into the pan. This can really be any kind you want. This is vegetable oil today. While this sears, I'm gonna start getting some of my vegetables ready. I have some onion, I have celery, and I have some carrots. And I'm just gonna go ahead and get everything diced. The quantity here is right for a standard pie plate, but if you've got, a beef stew or a braised beef recipe that you love, this would be a great time to make it your own, turn that into a pie filling. This is formulated a little bit thicker than some stews would be because we want it to be sliceable ultimately, but you can see the ratio, and that's what I love about savory baking, is it sort of allows you some of the flexibility that you have with cooking, but some of the rule following that you have with baking. So it's really the best of both worlds. All right, I've got all my veggies chopped. I've seared off all my beef, so I'm just gonna go ahead and put all these veggies into the same pot to start making this filling. So we'll just cook all of this over medium heat until these vegetables start to become tender and release some of their moisture. One good indicator always is the onions starting to look a little bit translucent. Okay, our vegetables are looking amazing. The best part is they have this beautiful golden brown color because they've picked up all of that delicious beef bits from the bottom of the pan. And now I'm gonna add a little bit of butter to the pot because I need to thicken this up, so we need to make a roux. And then I've got some all-purpose flour here. Once the butter is melted, I'm gonna sprinkle this as evenly as I can over the surface of the pot. And we're gonna cook that down until the mixture starts to thicken a little bit, just for a few minutes to cook off that floury flavor. And cooking the flour is also gonna be what helps this get nice and thick a little bit later. Now we can start really treating this like a stew. So what I wanna do is I wanna add some broth to it. This is beef broth. Also have some beer here. You can really use any kind of beer. Obviously, a darker beer is going to leave behind a more noticeable flavor. This is an amber ale, which is kind of a nice middle ground of leaving behind some really nice beer flavor while also being pretty mild in the final stew. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of tomato paste to this as well. While this is starting to warm up, I'm also gonna toss a bay leaf in here, and we'll just let this come to a simmer. Once it comes to a simmer, we're gonna add our beef back into this, and we are going to cook it over medium or even low heat, just at a very gentle simmer until the beef is really nice and tender. And remember, it is going to bake again in the oven, so while it should be nice and thick at the end of cooking this filling, it's going to become even thicker, and the meat is going to become even more tender after we bake the final pie. And then of course, we're gonna need to cool this filling down completely. So that is one thing that I think some people already think, that pie baking is kind of a long process. But one of the things I always try to encourage people to do is to divvy these parts up. And especially as we're thinking about the holiday season, I love this because there's things I can do ahead of time. Stews like this actually really benefit from sitting overnight and just allowing those flavors to even meld more. So you can make your stew one day, make your house smell amazing, maybe even make a double batch and eat some of it for lunch, and then put the rest of it away and then ready to make your pie once it's nice and cooled down. I've got some of my beef stew filling. This has already been cooked until tender and cooled down completely, and you can see how nice and thick it got, but I still need to make our topping kind of fresh right before the final stages. So what we're gonna do is make a version of Duchess potatoes. Now this is a style of potato that's basically a mashed potato that is typically piped and then baked so it gets this kind of crispy exterior. We're gonna put the Duchess potatoes on top of this pie, and what I love about it is it sort of ends up looking a little bit like toasted meringue from a distance, and then you're like, just kidding, it's mashed potatoes. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to melt some butter. And I'm just gonna put this on the back to melt down a little bit. And then we're gonna mix some other ingredients together. I need some egg yolks. I need 3 egg yolks, so I'm gonna separate some whites out here. And the egg yolks are one of the things that give these potatoes kind of their final texture and richness, but they also help it brown really evenly, the egg yolks that are inside of this. And I've got some cream here, and I'm just gonna mix the egg yolks and the cream together. Now these are nice and drained. I'm gonna put them back in the pot that they were in, and I'm just gonna give them a good mash. And you can use a potato masher for this if you've got a food mill or a ricer, whatever you want to use. And I'll get them started, but I'm not gonna do too much because I do have other ingredients to add, and as everyone knows, we don't want to overmash our potatoes because they start to get gluey instead of being delicious and fluffy. I've got my melted butter here. I'm going to add it while whisking constantly, and again, I'm only adding 4 tablespoons, so I'm leaving a little bit behind. I just want to whisk constantly because this is still warm. I don't want to overheat this at all. Great. I'm also going to add some Parmesan cheese into this mixture too. And this is just something obviously for the saltiness and for the flavor, but again, that little bit of cheese is also gonna help this brown so, so, so beautifully. And this is gonna go into my potatoes. Again, I've got the heat off of this now, so just because it's still in the pot, not cooking this anymore, we're just adding this mixture. And then what I'm gonna do is once it's all incorporated, I'm gonna mash it a little bit more, but I just don't wanna ever overdo it. Wow, this smells and looks amazing. All right, let's give this a little bit of seasoning. Some salt and pepper. And then once this is nice and seasoned, this is where it gets fancy. So it would absolutely be okay to just put this on top of the pie and swoop it around with a spatula and bake it that way. It would be delicious, in fact. But Duchess potatoes are typically piped using a star tip like this one. And so that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna use this star tip, and like I said, it kind of reminds me then a little bit of meringue, like piped toasted meringue on the top, because the potatoes also get nice and toasty. So I'm gonna just drop some taters in this piping bag. So I've got my par-baked pie crust, and I have my cooled beef filling. We'll start by just piling that into our crust. Now my potatoes still are going to be a little bit warm because I just freshly made them, but they're not really coming in direct contact with the crust. So the reason we like this filling to cool down is because if this goes in hot, it literally builds up steam between it and the crust, and it's really unfortunate. It can definitely start to get kind of soggy or just a variance of textures. Now that we have our beef filling in a nice even layer, I'm just gonna pipe these potatoes all over the top. And I typically start on the outside of this As you can see, the potatoes are actually still steaming as I'm piping them. That is important because I do want the potatoes to be fresh, and as they cool down, they can get gluey and all sorts of problems can happen. And another reason that this star tip is used traditionally for this style of potatoes is it gives you kind of more surface area, more ridges for browning. Hello, look at this. I mean, am I right? And then what we can do is just drizzle the rest of the butter that we had here. I don't really want to brush it because I don't want to cut down or, push down any of those pretty things that we made, but just giving it a nice little drizzle and letting that butter fall in all those nooks and crannies. This is how I like to party. This is going to bake until the rest of the crust is golden brown, and ideally until the filling is starting to bubble up, and you can usually see it a bit at the sides. And then of course we're gonna see nice golden browning on our Duchess potato topping. So into the oven it goes. Oh my gosh, look how beautiful it is. This baked at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 35 to 40 minutes until we got all that beautiful browning happening on the potatoes and the filling bubbling up as well. Let's make my greens and hominy pie. This pie has two delicious fillings. It has braised greens that I opt to make a little bit spicy with some jalapeno, and it also has this delicious, creamy, cheesy layer of hominy. This is such a crazy good pie, so let's get started. The first thing I wanna do is I want to toast up this hominy a little bit. Then we're gonna move on to the braised greens right away, but the hominy really benefits from this little toasting. So what I'm gonna do is just drizzle a few tablespoons of olive oil over the hominy, and I'm gonna give it a little toss. This is canned hominy, and I drained it well, but the hominy obviously still has some moisture. So the toasting both removes some of that extra moisture and also just starts to get a little color and flavor on this hominy, and I really, really, really love it. If you're ever tight on time, I think I even say in the book that you can skip this step, but it only takes about 10 minutes to toast this up and get it really nice. So let's get it toasty. So now let's get thinking about our greens a little bit while that hominy is toasting. I'm gonna start by dicing up an onion. This is a sweet onion, which is what I really like to use for this. Let's start heating up a little bit of olive oil in my pan, and I'm gonna throw this onion in to start cooking once it gets a little bit hot. And then I will mince up our garlic and our jalapeno. So I've got my garlic and my jalapeno here, just gonna drop those in. My onions have become kind of translucent and have softened. So we'll just cook this for one more minute until the garlic is kind of fragrant. I'm gonna start adding my greens here. These are collards, and that's one of my favorites to use. So in the case of collards, I've removed them from the stem and kind of torn them into pieces, and I'm just gonna add them a few handfuls at a time, let them start to wilt, then I'll add some more. You could definitely use kale here, and if you're using something like chard, you can also cut up the tender stems and add those, give those a little saute first before you start adding all of the leaves. But definitely, any kind of green that you've got a surplus of works great for this application. All my greens have been added here, and I'm just gonna let the last addition that I added wilt down a little bit more, and then I'm gonna add some white wine to it. The idea here is to bring that to a simmer a tiny bit, give it that little bit of liquid, cover it, and braise these greens until they are really nice and tender. Once they are really nice and tender, we can take the lid off, let some of that moisture evaporate off, and it's pretty much done as our pie filling. Let's start on our cheesy, creamy hominy filling. This is such a yummy, yummy, I just love this. So I'm gonna trim my scallions here. And Derek said yesterday as he was prepping this dish is more scallion than hominy. And there are a lot of scallions in here, but it is so delicious. It's basically the main allium-y, oniony flavor in this recipe. We'll cook those scallions until they start to get kind of tender, and then we're basically, just gonna turn it into a delicious creamy sauce. So I'm gonna add some butter to my pot. These do not take very long to cook, and I am gonna give them a little bit of seasoning. Then what we're gonna do is sprinkle some flour into this pot. Just gonna try to do it in a nice even layer, and we're gonna cook another roux using the fat that is still in our pan here. And cook it for about a minute or two just to cook off that floury flavor and give us the thickening power that we need. Let's add our milk now into this mixture. And what we're gonna do is bring this to a simmer. Okay, this is looking beautiful. It's simmering and it's starting to thicken. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my toasted hominy in here. Now I'm going to keep cooking this until it gets nice and thick. It's already pretty much there. Just gonna let it thicken a tiny bit more than this. Sort of want it to thickly coat the spoon. Right now I can still sort of see the spatula through it and see how it's dripping. So let's give it one more moment here. All right, cheese o'clock. Okay, there we go. So I've got both of my fillings done now. I've got my delicious braised greens. I've got my hominy. I need to let them both cool down completely. One way you can do this a lot quicker is by spreading it onto a baking sheet. That increased surface area will bring the temperature down a lot faster. So if you're feeling impatient, you can opt for that route. Or if you're making some of these things the day before you want to bake the pie, you can just let them cool to room temperature and then store them in the fridge overnight. All right, I've got both of my cooled fillings here, as well as my cooled par-baked pie crust. So I'm gonna start with the greens in the base of the pie pan. And one of the things that's really important with these greens is to really pack them in. We don't wanna just like dump this in and then dump the other filling on top. So you'll see I'm using the back of my spoon as I spoon it in to make sure that it is forming in a nice even layer. And you'll be amazed what a difference this makes, because packing it in will also help this slice better later. So we really, really want that in as tight as we can get it. So we've got a nice layer of that, and we'll just go ahead and spoon our hominy mixture on top. Oh my gosh, look how good this looks. Okay, this is going to go into a 375-degree oven, and we are looking for this top layer to be really nice and golden brown. This isn't as much of a bubbly pie, so the brownness is really going to be our main doneness indicator. And one of the reasons that we don't have to worry as much about the doneness of these other items is everything is fully cooked. So now what we're doing is kind of baking for that final sliceable texture and to finish browning this crust. So into the oven it goes until it's nice and golden brown. I can't wait to show you what it looks like when it comes out. This pie baked at 375 for 40 to 45 minutes till it was nice and brown on top. Let's make my Manchego Chess Pie. Now, a chess pie is a type of custard pie that is traditionally thickened with both eggs and a small amount of cornmeal. It gives it its signature texture, but subbing out the sugar in this recipe that's normally a sweet pie, and instead adding some Manchego cheese takes this to a deliciously salty place. I am obsessed with this pie, and it's so, so easy to make. So I'm gonna start by cracking 4 eggs into my mixing bowl here. And actually, let me give them a whisk first. All right, great. Now I'm going to add some buttermilk. I also want to add a little bit of vinegar. Along with the vinegar, we can also add a little bit of melted butter. And here goes the cornmeal. I really want to mix that well to make sure it doesn't clump up at all and is evenly distributed throughout. Finally, I'm gonna add some different spices. I'm going to add some smoked paprika, black pepper, and of course some salt. whisk those all up. And then finally, I just need my Manchego, which I've finely grated. Finely grating the Manchego instead of grating it more coarsely like on a box grater really helps it to kind of disperse evenly throughout this custard. So you can see I'm working with a really, really finely grated, light and fluffy Manchego here. I'm gonna go ahead and just add all of that in and stir it up really well. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for this pie. That's it. That's all we have to do to this pie. So now I've got my par-baked crust, and we'll just pour our custard right inside. This is going to go into a 375-degree oven, and what we're looking for is the classic custard pie doneness indicator, which is that it should be set around the outside edge, but still slightly jiggly in the center. So into the oven it goes. When it comes out, the crust and the surface of this custard are going to be a lovely golden brown. The Manchego Chess Pie bakes at 375 for 35 to 40 minutes until it's nice and brown on top. This pie is delicious if you cool it completely to room temperature, which I would typically do for custard pies, but it's also delicious served warm. Let's cut these pies! Casual crust flex. So I've got my quince paste on the top of my Manchego pie. This pie, oh my God, it's so salty and tangy. The quince paste on top is chef's kiss. You are heavier, but still sturdy. Evil laughter. Get some crispy potato, get some crust. This is so comforting. You can taste that beer, and then the potatoes, the tops of them are crispy and buttery. Some people would use a fork, but I'm not going to. I'm just gonna eat it like this. That was not a stage bite. Hold on. A little bit of spicy, a little bit of creaminess, all those scallions, the hominy, the texture of it is just incredible. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, which was all about some of my favorite show-stopping savory pies from my brand new book, Savory Baking. I am so excited for you to try your hand at some of these pies. They are worthy of the best, most special occasion, but also would be wonderful on the dinner table any night of the week. These are absolutely all so yummy and so fun to show off your pie skills that you've learned here on Bake It Up a Notch. As always, all of these recipes are linked in the video description below, and of course you can also find them in my new book, Savory Baking. If you love pies and all things pastry, please do me a flavor. If you love pies and all things savory baking, please do me a favor and click like and subscribe so you can be made aware of all of our new episodes as they become available. And be sure to tune in for our next episode, which is all about tiny bites of baked brie, and I can't wait. Until then, as always, happy baking!